Well, hello, everybody. It's Bertha Lewis from the Black Institute again. Once again, here we are at our Real Raw Race Roundtable. As you all may know, and some of you may not, the Black Institute is just that. We are an action tank, a think tank that takes action. Of course, we have four big areas. We deal with Black people, people of color in the environment, people of color in the education space, people of color in economics, and people of color in immigration, especially Black immigrants. This is, I think, our third roundtable. As you had seen on the screen before, this is our All Races, All Faces series. We had just published our second volume of that book, in which we looked at all immigrant communities across New York City. And since this is Pride Month, and as well as, yay, Juneteenth finally became a national holiday, we thought, let us combine race and LGBT. We have a great group of panelists for you, and this is going to be a real raw race discussion about racism, whether it exists or whether it doesn't, in the LGBTQ community. So let me just introduce our first panelist, Uche Chukwu Onwa. And Uche is the co-director and organizing coordinator of the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project. Now, they work with LGBTQ+ and HIV positive prisoners and those that have recently come out of detention. Now, Uche is Nigerian born. He's an organizer, trainer, abolitionist, and a movement strategist. And he fled his home in Nigeria due to the repression and persecution he faced as a gay man. At the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, he focuses on building and strengthening the membership base while maintaining partnerships and coalitions with other organizations. He also leads a QDEP's Leadership Development Program for cisgender, queer, and trans women, and the gender non-conforming people. Uche is also a member of the Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project, and his work has been featured on Windy City, Times, Sunderland, Plus Magazine, BuzzFeed, Pulitzer Center, and much, much more. Welcome, Uche. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Our next panelist, who those of you who live in New York City, and I think some of those who don't know, Alan Roscoff. Now, Alan may not be exactly Black, but he's got a Black heart. That's what they've told me. And he's been the leader in the LGBT community and social justice movements for over 5 decades. Alan has co-authored the nation's first gay rights bill, and along with Jim Owls, he later co-founded the nation's first gay Democratic club. Alan has worked on hundreds of political campaigns, was the first openly gay person appointed to a community board here in New York City, was also the first to serve in the offices of an elected official. Way back in 1974, he joined the executive staff of the New York City Comptroller, Harrison Golden. Subsequently, he served in the administrations of our current of Governor Mario Cuomo, father of the current Governor Cuomo. And let's not talk about Cuomo tonight, Alan. He also served under Mayor David Dinkins and several other elected officials. Alan is most proud to have established the Jim Owls Liberal Democratic Club, which brings together hundreds of prominent members of the LGBT community, straight allies, party and elected officials, and people from the performing arts. And just recently, Alan just had a fabulous gala in which he raised a lot of money and he had just stars that lit up the night. Hi, Alan. Welcome.
Hello. Always great to be with you, Bertha. And hello, everybody else.
Our next panelist, this guy is fierce. Jawanza James Williams. Now, he's a Black queer radical abolitionist and a socialist. He's currently the director of organizing at Vocal New York. Now, that's a grassroots organization building power among poor and low-income New Yorkers. He's also a member of Democratic Socialists of America and a founding member of its Afrocentrist and Socialists of Color caucus. Hi, Jawanza. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Ms. Lewis. I'm very, very honored to be here. And this is my first time working with the Black Institute, and I imagine a long relationship. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be real rough and raw, baby. And our final panelist is Jared Trujillo. Now, Jared is a policy attorney. He's an advocate and a Hofstra Law School professor. Jared has served as the president of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys and as a juvenile and criminal defense attorney at the Legal Aid Society. Jared has also lobbied on issues on the local, state, and the national level, and he's particularly dedicated to advocacy surrounding the decriminalization of sex work and the decarceration of sex workers. Jared is a former sex worker, and he strives to center the most marginalized sex workers in his advocacy. All right, Jared. Hi, thank you. Say hi. Well, we'll fix that. We can't hear Jared. Hi, Jared.
Hi, y'all. Sorry, I've been talking to y'all while my mic was muted. So, but I'm very excited to speak with everyone and to be in community with everyone on this panel.
Okay. Well, everybody, as you can see, we have an illustrious panel. Probably we will have the next LGBTQ panel. We'll have the sisters on board, but tonight we have that male energy. So listen. This is the Black Institute. We do talk about real, raw race things. And so I'm going to open this up. Now, listen, panelists, if you got something to say, I know y'all, ain't none of y'all shy. Just go ahead and say it. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about racism in the LGBTQIA community, okay? We're going straight there. You know, I'd like to know from each of you, you know, whether you have experienced racism, what has been your experiences, either as a gay person of color or even being an ally of gay people of color, and how you've been treated or how you've seen other people treated in the LGBT community. So who wants to start and go right in?
I can say something. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jared, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll say, you know, like my personal experiences, I mean, I think that all of us can talk about that, you know, for hours. But I want to talk about it specifically within the advocacy context, because I think that racism within the LGBTQ community, particularly when it comes to advocacy, it's always been there and it's always been prevalent. You know, something that I found really interesting when the Heritage of Pride excluded cops from this year's Pride events is that in the New York Times article bashing that decision, they said, at one time in Pride, they'd want anyone to march, and that has never been the case. In 1973, when Sylvia Rivera gave her famous "Y'all Better Quiet Down" speech, something that she really talked about is how Black and brown trans women in particular were always excluded. It's great that the center has a room named for her now, but while she was actually alive, they excluded her from the LGBT center in the village because she effectively just wanted Black and brown homeless kids to be able to sleep there in the winter to get out of the cold. You know, Edie Windsor, hero. Glad that she gets acknowledged. The person who was the head of, who was the poster child for the case that finally got rid of Doma. But Tyrone Garner, one of the men who was at the head of the case that Lawrence v. Texas, the case that decriminalized sodomy in 2003, the Black man that was in that case died at 39 years old, so broke that his attorney had to his family had to bury him in a black plastic bag, his ashes in a black plastic bag, until his attorney at Lambda Legal was actually able to raise the money. And those are not things that have gone away. Those are things that are still persistent today in the advocacy community. I can't tell you how many calls I'm on where I'm the only Latino lawyer, where I'm the only Black lawyer. I can't tell you how many calls I'm on, and not as much today, but certainly traditionally, where we care about marriage, we care about surrogacy. Fulton v. Philadelphia just happened, which really screws over a lot of people, kids in foster care. You don't really see the same anger. And so I just think that the advocacy community and racism within the LGBTQ community, they just go hand in hand with who's elevated, with who we listen to, with what issues that we care about, and then ultimately by what communities or what subsections within the LGBTQ community that we're actually happy to put time and effort and real sweat equity behind.
Yeah, if I could jump in. First of all, Jared, it wasn't a community center. It was a Gay Activist Alliance firehouse, which we used as a headquarters. And it was at 99 Worcester Street in Soho, when Soho was a forest. I mean, it was deserted. And we kind of civilized Soho. But anyway, in the early days, I would say, the Gay Activist Alliance, if you look at the pictures of all the people at a meeting, it was probably about 95% white. Most of the people who were out then were white middle-class people. As difficult as it was for most of the people to come out, most of us lost our parents. I think it was more difficult for people of color to come out back then because they lacked the privilege, the stability, that middle-class white people had. So it's absolutely right that it was a white middle-class activist community. The leadership was mostly white people, mostly men. And, thinking there was some people of color that I could remember who were there, but few and far between. I want to bring up two instances of overt racism that really has always bothered me. I happen to be a close personal friend of the Reverend Sharpton going back to the early 80s. And I sit on his, I'm a trustee of his Human Rights Museum that's going to be opening within the next few years. But I remember a meeting we had in Tom Duane's office when Tom Duane was a council member. And we were organizing a press conference to denounce Ruben Diaz, the Reverend Ruben Diaz Sr., who said that gay people shouldn't come to New York for the gay games because we would spread AIDS. And they wanted to get people of faith at a press conference. And I said, oh, great. I'll ask Reverend Sharpton. I'm sure he'll be delighted to participate. And it was forbidden for him to be asked or for him to come to the press conference because Reverend Sharpton was divisive. And here was a group of white people deciding that Reverend Sharpton, and it was Christine Quinn, who was the chief of staff, was not welcome at the press conference. And during her mayoral campaign, she talked about how Reverend Sharpton was always respectful to her. But I want to bring up another instance. A few years ago, there was a rally at Sheridan Square. It could have been on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or some emergency that we had in the community. And the two chairs of the rally were looking for people of color to speak at it. So I said, Oh, great. I'll ask Reverend Sharpton. I'm sure he'll be delighted to speak at the rally. And the two chairs said no. Reverend Sharpton is divisive. He is not allowed to speak at the rally. And one of the chairs comes from a multiracial family, just quit the Heritage of Pride because they're excluding the police, and people shouldn't be excluded. But it was okay to exclude Reverend Sharpton because here were white people deciding who could speak for the Black community. So there's been a lot of outrage. And I'll keep quiet in a minute. In the early days, the LGBT community, going back to the 70s, we were all lefties. We all went to the anti-Vietnam War protests in Washington. We all went to the Martin Luther King marches. Part of the collateral damage, it may be, of the success of the gay rights movement is that we've become so mainstream that our community is not consistently left-wing anymore. Our elected officials are not left-wing. Because they're gay and sometimes of color, they're considered lefties when their policies are not always. I'm glad to see the new uprising within the Democratic Party in New York, where people of color are really having a voice, unlike what it was decades ago.
Well, you know, when we talk about, and I'm so glad that Jared, you know, brought up history, because sometimes we forget who were the pioneers, but we also forget about racism, like just interpersonal racism. The first time most of us experience racism is on a personal level, you know, and what happens to us, because that's our experience. And it is, to me, quite telling when you have a hierarchy of mostly white males that say who is divisive and who isn't divisive, instead of trying to hear all people. And most, you know, folks think that, you know, all gay people are lefties or they're all progressives. But even within the Black community, Uche, you know, I know, like I say, the Black Institute is concerned about people of color and Black people here in this country, but also I think this is a global problem. Talk to us about the differences in experiences, racism in Nigeria and experiencing racism here in the States.
So thank you so much, and thanks, Gerard, for bringing light to that on the advocacy side. I think that a lot of times racism happen in multiple ways, but also for immigrant communities, it happened in more ways because, again, we as queer, Black queer immigrants, queer and trans immigrants, we experience, you know, we are being excluded in so many of the conversation that is happening. We experience racism within the institution. We experience racism within our queer and trans fellow queer and trans communities. I personally experienced, the first time I actually experienced racism was when I arrived into the United States, because back home in Nigeria we don't have colors, we don't have race. So I never.
Wait, Uche, what do you mean you don't have race in Nigeria? So, you don't got white people? You don't have.
No, well, there's no Black or white in Nigeria. Everyone is the same. So because Nigeria is I wouldn't say Nigeria is a Black country, because, again, like I said, we don't identify as either white or either Black, even though there are some white people who live in Nigeria, but would never get to, like, you know, struggle or have to experience, you know, racism or be discriminated because of our skin color, because everyone is considered to be just Nigerian. So me coming to the United States, and then experiencing racism, it was like overwhelming for me because it's something that I was not used to back home. And the first time that I experienced racism was on my arrival to the United States. I was held by immigration. I spent 3 months in immigration in ICE custody for just coming into the United States to seek safety and refuge as an openly gay man in Nigeria who was advocating for LGBTQ people to have safety and to have access to health, and also for human rights advocacy work in Nigeria that had, put my life at great risk and in danger. And I was publicly humiliated, attacked multiple times, beaten up, naked, put out, rejected by my family, excommunicated by the church. So it was a lot, and I lost so many of my friends that led me to coming to the United States to seek safety. So when I arrived at the United States at the airport, I was picked up by immigration. They said they're going to deport me because I genuinely don't have any reason of coming here, even though I do have a reason because I had a visa. That automatically is the reason and qualified me to come to the United States because the US Embassy gave me the visa. I didn't steal or. So, but again, like, I was handcuffed, I was shackled at the airport. My legs were chained together, my hands were chained, my nose, mouth, everything was covered. And they dragged me at the airport to detention. I didn't even know where I was being taken to. I just found myself in a detention center with other detainees. So when I got there, the nurse who worked there asked the officers, why did they have to cover my nose and mouth and all of that? The white officers specifically said, he is a black man, he's coming from Africa, he could be coming with Ebola, he could be coming with virus. He started mentioning names of viruses that, I could be coming with. So that was the first time that I experienced racism, because to me, so you covered me this way, you chained me because you think that I'm coming from Africa, you think that everyone who is coming from Africa have some sort of disease or virus that they're coming here to infect other people. So hearing that alone was like a wake-up call for me to say, oh, now you are welcome to America. And that wasn't my ideal or idea of what America is. And then, spending months in detention with all the experiences that are horrible experiences that I experienced there, and coming out and doing the work that I'm doing right now, I've seen a lot of Black, queer, and trans immigrant being treated poorly, being discriminated because of their color, because of their immigration status. 2 months ago, we lost one of our members who's a Black trans woman from Costa Rica, someone who was coming to the United States to seek safety. She was held by immigration, and she spent 1 year in ICE custody. And while she was there, she was put in solitary confinement. She was denied medical attention, and she was released from detention with multiple mental health trauma, mental health issues that she ended up taking her own life. And this is as a result of all the trauma that she experienced in ICE custody because of her skin color and because of her immigration status. Also within the movement, Black migrants are not included. In the Black Lives Matter movement, so many of this conversation is not including Black migrants. We are constantly being erased. In the immigration narratives, so many of the conversation are centered around the heteronormative lens without including LGBTQ plus migrants that even face more harassment, more stigma, discrimination in ICE custody. It's a lot for me to talk about, but I'm not just going to take time. Most of the time, I'm just going to end it here and maybe pass the mic to someone else.
Well, that, I don't know if you had been a white Nigerian immigrant, if that kind of thing would have happened to you. And you're right, here at the Black Institute, the reason that immigration, particularly Black immigration, is one of our major issue areas is first of all, we believe here that, and especially in Western society, racism is global. And the United States, you know, for you to get here, I think they were less concerned about you seeking asylum as a gay man than they were about you being a Black Nigerian. So the thing is, in racism, you know, there's systemic and institutional racism, and there's interpersonal racism. Like I said, sometimes you don't get that effect unless it directly affects you. But Jared, Geronza, I think, you know, you had said something in a conversation that we had earlier about, you know, the face of LGBTQ folks, who's accepted, who's in charge, as Alan was talking about, you know, who gets left out in history and even in today, as Jared was talking about. So share with us a little bit about your experiences with racism, you know, in this country and particularly in New York.
So, if I may, you know, going back historically, when the Gay Activist Alliance formed, prior to the formation, the only people that were public about being openly gay, who are on television, for instance, had their faces digitalized out or spoke in shadows, whether they're on Dick Cavett or Jack Paul, whatever. There is nobody who was out until the Gay Activist Alliance formed, and it was basically white activists who came forward and did all the talk shows and presented the gay rights movement as white gay male. That's how it started. And the people of color were kind of invisible to the general public. When you look at what happened in Dade County with Anita Bryant, it was clearly a white gay movement that was presented. And it took decades for that to change.
But still, I think as Jared brought up, there is a history. Black gay people didn't just pop out, you know, in the 20th century or just, you know, pop out. We've always been here. People have always been here, and Blackness has always been here. So, Geronza, I mean, you know, I get all agitated because I know, you know, we talk about slavery. There were gay slaves, okay? And nobody wants to talk about it. And people think New York City, oh, you're so open, you're so goddamn progressive, you know, because there is this white face. So talk a little bit about your experiences with racism just here in this so-called liberal city.
Yeah, sure thing. So first of all, I need to say to Uche, I'm very terribly sorry that happened to you. And we should absolutely all be responding. So I'm really grateful that that QDAP exists, the Queer Detainee Project. And I want to learn more about that situation in general, just about Black immigrants and Black migration, and just in ways that we as leftists need to show up better. But I really want to go back to something that Jared said and also really comment on a bit of what Alan is saying. So one, I want to say it's very important that when we're thinking about gay rights, gay history, or LGBTQ history, queer histories, and applying an analysis of race and class, that we understand how the centrality of what it means to be white and whiteness and how that affects everything, and it rolls out into every sort of factor and fabric of the society, every sector of work, et cetera, and contribution, including in advocacy work. So even the concept of coming out does not necessarily account for all the ways in which we as queer Black people are the descendants of enslaved Africans or are African people around the world, express and sort of operate within our sort of queer identities that are sort of antithetical to heteronormative configuration. So what I'm saying is that Black people have been out for generations before the gay rights movement as we understand it in this country. Now, the being out status is that sort of framework comes from a particular period and comes from a sort of centralizing of white, normally gay men and gay women who are gay and lesbians and who are either working or middle class people, you know, having all that stability, economic stability, and sort of like ways of generating and creating and maintaining safety and security for themselves, where these kinds of concepts are born that doesn't necessarily account for our experiences. Because I think a lot about people like James Baldwin. I don't think of James Baldwin as necessarily closeted and, you know, pretty, you know, until like later periods of his life where I'm reading of his books, I get the sense that he's been much more queer, openly queer for much longer than perhaps 1970. But I guess also what I wanted to say is that because of this sort of centrality that I'm naming that still persists to this day about sort of like understanding the needs, the experiences of queer people, of LGBTQ people from the perspective, from the vantage point of cisgendered, hetero, like normative, gay men who are normally white and moneyed, middle class, it sort of blunts the agenda for our movement for gay queer liberation, which is really liberation for all of us, regardless of one's gender identity or gender perception or sexual practices. And we lose sort of the power of what we can do because the agenda gets blunted by that. So whenever you have nationwide marriage equality, whenever you have, you know, surrogacy, as Jared was saying before, suddenly we've reached the pinnacle of our rights and we've assimilated into a dominant system, a dominant narrative, a dominant sort of framework, distribution of resources and power that inherently depends upon the dehumanization, the subjugation, the exploitation of the vast majority of us, namely Black and brown queer people. So there's that. And a concrete example that I can name that I thought about this much earlier after we had a brief check-in about this conversation, that 5 years ago, the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, where, you know, scores of queer people were gunned down inside of a nightclub, which was incredibly horrifying for queer people and people in general, I think, are conscientious around the world. And in New York City, I remember at this particular time, the Stonewall Democrats organized a vigil and a rally outside of the Stonewall bar, you know, to condemn this violence against queer people, because it was a very, very triggering, terrible time for a lot of us, you know, queer people. And Governor Cuomo, the existing Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, was sort of like a headline speaker at this rally. And I learned at the time that he was going to present. So I planned with my colleague at the time, Jason Walker, who we were both working on, you know, on AIDS housing related issues, namely on the expansion of HASA, the HIV and AIDS Services Administration, which basically is enhanced services, economic supports for people who are low income living with HIV in New York City. And at the time, you could only qualify for those services if you had a symptomatic HIV infection, an AIDS diagnosis, and of course met the sort of income thresholds. And what we were fighting for was to expand HASA eligibility to include all people diagnosed with HIV who are living in New York City, who are low income, regardless of their HIV sort of progression. So regardless if they were symptomatic, regardless if they had a T cell count lower than 500, which would have given them an AIDS diagnosis. Because essentially what the city of New York was telling people who are low income living with HIV, a vast majority of them low income young people, LGBTQ young people experiencing homelessness, folks who use drugs, folks who are engaged in sex work or survival sex, etc. The city was like, well, you can't get these supports that we know you need to stabilize your life and sometimes to save your life unless you get sick. You're just not sick enough. So we had a campaign along with many organizations, the Hostel for All campaign it was called, to make sure that we could expand those services. You know, and Governor Cuomo was one of the primary barriers at this time of us getting the state money that we needed in the budget so that the city of New York could expand these services because it costs a lot of money. So when I learned that Governor Cuomo, because of the death of Black and brown, well, Latinx primarily, queer people in Florida, were gunned down in this bar, the same kind of folks that come from the same kind of communities that whose proximity to HIV and proximity to homelessness and proximity to police violence, etc., is so much closer than, you know, your average white gay moneyed person. To use that moment to uplift himself and his political career. In my analysis, he was using it to launch his platform around, you know, gun control, gun violence prevention. And it was at a time whenever he was thinking about running for president. And it was very much a conversation. So I was offended that Governor Cuomo, who was standing in the way of providing direct services to Black and brown people living with HIV, that he would use this moment of our collective suffering to uplift himself and his political platform to suggest that somehow he's a savior to our people. So what I decided to do, and here's where the racism comes in, it was a very touchy and a very tricky time to do a direct action. But I found my way through this massive crowd of people outside of the Stonewall Inn. And a trans woman in particular actually led me through the crowd. And the moment that Governor Cuomo got on stage, I pulled from my bag a megaphone. And at the moment that Governor Cuomo began to speak, I said, Governor Cuomo, very loudly, how dare you try to talk about this right now? We need to expand HASA because people are dying. And then a crowd of white gay men, they surrounded me, right? And then they shouted to me, not today, not today, not. And mind you, I'm a young, and at the time, like only had been, you know, housed in New York City for like a year. So that means that I had just recently experienced homelessness. I was working on very vulnerable people's issues around HIV, which heavily impacts our people. And for them to try to shut me down whenever I'm challenging the state's most powerful politician in our community, in our, you know, home of our political movement, on the very streets where this began in this country, and for them to violently shut me down, to violently silence me, was the kind of racism that is virulent, it was overt, and it was incredibly destructive. And it reminds me of how if the centrality of my experience as a Black queer person living with HIV is not centered, is not made priority, moments like these happen where actually I'm talking about saving the lives of Black and brown people in New York City who are at risk of developing AIDS and dying. And this governor is a primary barrier, yet you're challenging me because you can't hear me, because you can't see past this political moment that this governor is taking advantage of, making political in a way that is unnecessary about what happened to us. So if you really care about our lives, then house us. Make sure we have the kinds of things that we actually need. Put the money where your politics are, where you suggest they are. And I think that because of that, that's why there's this idea that AIDS is over. That's why there's this idea that somehow the gay agenda doesn't include ending homelessness across the board, because we are the ones directly impacted overwhelmingly. And I think that that's just a extreme, but a small example of the ways in which racism has sort of shown up, especially in protest and advocacy spaces that are specifically LGBTQ and specifically democratic. And this is why I'm so critical of the sort of two-party system, though I'm also strategic about, you know, building political power.
Well, I just want to say, I think that was the rally that Al Sharpton was forbidden to speak at. And I left out Salsa Soul Sisters, which was women of color that formed the group, joined the Gay Activist Alliance days, and they were like super great. I don't want to leave them out of our history.
Well, but see, I think Jawanza has been eloquent in his telling of that story. But for me, my brother in 1985 died of AIDS. Okay, my brother was gay from birth, and we went through this in the Black community. What does it mean? You know, total denial. And so the AIDS crisis at that time, I remember going around the corner, because I had a little theater on Waverly Place, to the gay men's health crisis, and tried to talk to these, you know, white men and women about my brother. And the fact that always, whether it is COVID, whether it is HASA, we are disproportionately affected. I mean, it just is. So rather, Cuomo uses, gun violence and I can get a twofer on this. I think Geronta's point of the centrality of Black and brown people, of people of color, who, by the way, will be the majority in this country in a minute. So, but one of the things, and Jared, maybe, and Uche, you can talk about, there is this like tremendous attack on Black trans women. So what the hell? What the hell is going on? Is it a combination? Because you're Black and you're a woman and you're trans. I mean, we have this tremendous fight, and now it's getting down into the children. So you can't even grapple with your sexuality when you're younger now. So, this is a tremendous in the 21st century backlash. So can somebody speak to that? But also this question of identity. You're either trans or you're male or you're lesbian. I mean, what about this whole identity thing? This, especially when it comes to trans folks. Who can speak to that?
I'll speak briefly, mainly because I need to hop off in a minute. I apologize. I do just want to note that the attacks on trans people, they're not really new. We're hearing, a lot of laws that specifically target trans folks. In the past few months, we've passed more laws as a country as a whole that has specifically named trans children than we have in the past decade. But that doesn't mean that the system just started attacking trans folks. The system has always been really fixed on attacking specifically Black trans women. About 47% of Black trans women are incarcerated at some point in their lives. And that's not new. In New York, we just passed this thing called the Walking While Trans ban. And it's great that we took one statute off the books that has really been weaponized by law enforcement to brutalize and target and terrorize Black and brown trans communities. But that's one of many. Nearly every law within the penal code has been disproportionately used towards Black folks and disproportionately used towards Black women. And one of the issues that you have, to your point before about why Black trans women are so targeted, one, because they're Black and because the system loves to attack Black people. Two, because they're women, and as Malcolm X always said, the most disrespected person in America is a Black woman. And then three, because we know that Black men are over-incarcerated and overrepresented in the carceral system and in homelessness populations and in the foster care system. Black trans women are not always given their full femininity. So they're oftentimes criminalized like men because we don't, as a society, recognize that they're women. Leilene Polanco Extravaganza, an Afro-Latina trans woman who died alone in a cell at Rikers because of misdemeanors. If you look at some of her rap sheets, it uses her dead name, which is ridiculous. Some of her rap sheets from years ago use her dead name, which is absolutely disgusting and ridiculous. And so if you look at some of the reasons why, why those folks are the most overrepresented in the carceral system, that's why. And I just want to know before I head off, that when we talk about the carceral system or how people living with HIV are treated or the unhoused population or other, we have to really start thinking about where does it actually start. And it's so frequently, it really starts with who's represented in the foster care system. The best way to determine who's going to be in the juvenile justice system is who's in the foster care system. The best way to determine who's going to be the adult carceral system is who is in the juvenile penal system, which again goes back to who is in the foster care system. Why are Black folks overrepresented in foster care? Because of how they're over-policed. And policing looks a lot of different ways. If you're in a homeless shelter, DHS, specifically in New York, the Department of Homeless Services, they have their own police force. We don't have enough DV shelters for people in New York City, but we have an entire separate police force just for DHS. If you live in public housing, which is of course mostly Black and brown in New York City, like they have their own police force. ACS, the way that they interact with Black families, it's different than they do with other people. Hell, before you even leave the hospital as an infant in New York, in everywhere really, but specifically in New York, we test Black and brown mothers. And if they test positive for marijuana or for anything else, we are much more likely to snatch their Black or brown baby away from them than we are for anywhere else. So like if you just look at the carceral system looks a lot of ways. It's not just cops, it's not just ICE, it's ACS, it's DPS, it's so many other people. When we put those people in people's lives, of course they're going to have worse outcomes, because like we tell people from the beginning that they're a criminal. We criminalize people in many ways. And I used to be a juvenile defense attorney, and taking someone away from their mom feels an awful lot like putting someone in jail. I promise you. Tell any 7-year-old that it's different and they will not believe you. And so like we just have so many systems that really criminalize Black skin and Black bodies in so many ways that just perpetuates throughout someone's life. And thank you. I really appreciate you for having this discussion. And I always appreciate everyone on the panel. Like Jawanza, like I look up to you so much. You know, Uche, I love the work that y'all do. And Alan, you've been doing this work since like I was negative 20 years old. So I really appreciate everyone on this panel, and I hope to see you all soon.
All right, and I just want to say, Jared, why don't you run for office? I mean, I keep telling you, please run for office.
He wants everybody to run for office. But what you said, Jared, was true. You said, listen, let's take, we have to take some action. So, Alan, Uche, Jawanza, what action do you need, do you think needs to be taken that the Black and brown queer community can do, the allies like Alan can do, before we leave, what is the one or two things that you think needs to get done in order to tackle this? Because it's been around for a long time, it ain't going away, but here's what I know. You gotta fight. So, what do we do?
Well,
go ahead, Uche.
I think so. First, I want to say, Joanza, thanks for really calling out and naming those experiences, because I think that I relate to, when you say that you wanted to speak and you were being shut down, say this is not the time, because this is what we always have to face. Even in Nigeria, last year, there's a movement, the NSAS movement, that was happening, and people being killed, and people were on the street demanding to abolish the police, which is, the SARS, which is the police system. And queer and trans folks in the country also joined the march to, demand that queer life matter, and we should also respect and recognize queer lives that have been harmed by the police. And the heteronormative folks were saying, this is not the time. This is not the time for you guys to show up. There's a more important thing to talk about, and not the queer lives. So it's like, why do we have to constantly be told that this is not the time? We have to always show up. I think that, the next step to your question about what can we do, I think that white folks need to start stepping back and start giving power to Black people. Most times white people are taking a lot of spaces, and sometimes they don't even recognize that they're actually taking so much space. So you should recognize the privilege that you have as a white person, and make ways for Black people that have not really been put in leadership, that have not been really recognized. Put Black people in leadership within your organization, within your institution. Recognize Black, queer, and trans migrants that don't even have a voice. We have to really struggle to be on the table. We have to really struggle to be recognized, because most times we are not being seen. The conversation, even within the LGBTQ plus movement, the Black LGBTQ plus immigrants, in general, LGBTQ plus immigrants are not even recognized. Sometimes, like, I get so overwhelmed, I get so tired of fighting, trying to make sure that we make table for us, try to make sure that we are there, and not just we are there speaking out for ourselves, because at the end, it is our story, and we are the one to really tell the story and know what we really want. So people should start, supporting queer and trans immigrant organization, because we don't get support. We don't even get support from the government. So we have to really, struggle to get organized mutual aids for our community, for our members that are struggling with homelessness, struggling with immigration detention, struggling with rejection, discrimination from their family. It is a lot to leave your homeland, your family, where you grew up, and come to a new country where you don't have any support, you don't have any family, and trying to really go through this process of the immigration. It is a lot. So people should look out for QDEP and donate your money. Pride is coming to an end. Give money to organizations that is doing this amazing work.
That's good. Always have a good commercial. Alan, you were gonna speak. What should we do?
I've been talking. I forget what I was going to say. I was got engrossed.
What action do we take?
What I was going to say is, I, for better or for worse, after my activism at the Gay Activist Alliance, and we had all the candidates there, I got very involved in working with politicians at City Hall to get the gay rights bill through. And then we formed the Gay Democratic Club. It was the first in the nation. And now we have the Jim Owls Liberal Democratic Club. We're pretty well integrated. We have, straight and gay, people of color. We got the president of Black Lives Matter, Greater New York, as an officer. We have Al Sharpton. Jared's on a board. And one of the things that we've worked very hard on is getting people out of prison. Another member of our board, Black woman, a lesbian from Brooklyn, served 39 years, I believe, at Bedford. And with the help of District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, we got her out. And then, of course, we got Judith Clark out, a white woman, lesbian. But it was our efforts that got the few people out that got out under this awful governor that doesn't believe in letting people out. He doesn't believe in letting people out. And that's why so many people, especially during COVID, are dying in prisons. And I would urge all the groups to work together on the elder parole, which we have a chance of passing. It would guarantee that all people 55 years or older who have served 15 years in prison are eligible to go before a parole board. And that's and we're also very quickly, we got over 100 people, candidates that want to remove Edward I. Koch's name off the 59th Street Bridge. One, because of his AIDS denial, and that's why we became the epicenter of AIDS in this country. He did not do anything in the beginning on AIDS. And also his blatant racism. Remember when he called Ron Dellums a Zulu warrior and a Watutsi from Berkeley and closed Sydenham Hospital and called blacks and Hispanics who worked in poverty pimps. And we have to get his name off that bridge. And it just must be done. And if everybody could help us do that, we have a good chance of getting it done. Jemani Williams is supporting the legislation. It was introduced by Danny Drum. Corey Johnson supports it. Myla Wiley, etc. Help us get it done. Lobby.
All right. Lobby. Okay, Devonta, you got the last word of the panel.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been wonderful. A couple of things. Number one, happy Kwame Ture Day to everybody out there. If you don't know who Kwame Ture is, please Google him. The first thing I would say, and I think it aligns with a lot of what Uche said and what Alan is also saying, I simply am not interested in convincing anybody that I'm a human being, who deserves all of the things that I deserve, that we all deserve. So that's the work of movements. Like whenever we're talking about getting people to understand that, you know, Black trans women are human beings, like I'm not trying to have that conversation with individuals necessarily, because that's not going to do the work that I need to happen for this to stop happening to Black trans women. That's the work of movement, where the society has a change in consciousness. But what I am going to do, what we can do immediately, what I want every person on here, if you are not a card-carrying member of an organization that is building political power to make sure that you and your people and your communities, the people that you care about, have the right to the things that they deserve, you're making a huge mistake. We have to be organized. We have to build institutions. So that's for white folks, if you can't lead it, you got to fund it. Point blank, period. I know that sounds extra, but it takes time, resources, and money to build organizations. Kwame Ture would often say that African people, Black people around the world, are some of the most disorganized people. And he doesn't mean that we are not organized in our individual lives, or that I can't organize my bedroom. What he means is we need to build our own institutions that are going to build the kind of power that are going to, you know, help create the conditions for us to find liberation, to achieve liberation. So one of the things that I say to people all the time whenever they have issues with nonprofits, like, oh, you know, the nonprofit industrial complex, et cetera, these kinds of concepts, I hear you. These are legitimate phenomena. However, not all nonprofits are the same. You know, HRC is vastly different than Vocal New York. You know what I'm saying? So like, and you need to be able to hold that complexity and understand what it is that you're funding, what it is that you're engaged in, and how it's achieving its work. What is its theory of change? And because the reason I say that, though, is because if a social movement, if massive social movements, the likes of which we've never seen before, and we've seen profound movements in this country, but the kind of movement that we need to achieve actual liberation for all of us, I don't think we've built it yet. But the primary fuel, the primary factor of any social movement are human beings, are people that are willing and able to wage the movement or the revolution, as Angela Davis would say. And people cannot do that, though, if they are in crisis, if they are unhealthy. So if there is 500,000 plus people across the United States experiencing homelessness, if they're looking for housing constantly, they can't come to the political education meeting. Therefore, they can't help you build the base and build the movement. So it's important that organizations are working. So if you have an issue with reforms, I'm an abolitionist who understands when reforms are necessary and when they're not necessary. So what I'm saying is, if we want to build a social movement that's going to change the world, that's going to help us get towards liberation, we have to have the people that are able to do that. And that means we have to work on the kinds of issue-based campaigns, which is why I have not ran for office. We got to work on the issue-based campaigns that are going to alleviate the suffering and help people understand what is at stake. And the last thing I'll say, Bertha, and I'll leave it here, is that I created a movement builder movie night program at Vocal New York. And I just finished tonight, before this call, a 4-part series called Exterminate All the Brutes, written and produced by Raoul Peck, Haitian Black man. And what it's important for us to be able to draw the connection and hold the complexity that the story, the situation that we're all responding to, that all of this stuff that we're experiencing, it is a grand story. And it has global implications, and it has an old history. And we're talking about white supremacy, patriarchy, power and domination, about colonialism, about imperialism, and all of the parts, all of the culture, all of the stuff, all of the policies that led to genocides, to the slaughtering of Jewish people, to the slaughtering of African peoples, to the slaughtering of indigenous peoples in this country, to the blood-soaked soil of stolen land that then enslaved Black people, tilled to build this massive economy. All of this stuff is intimately connected. And if we're not able to understand how the plight of a Black trans woman today in the 21st century and her experience is intimately connected to the transatlantic slave trade, that is intimately connected to capitalism, to domination, to patriarchy, if we can't make those connections, then we can't diagnose the problem, and therefore we cannot cure the disease.
Well, people, y'all heard it here from this. I mean, you all have blown my mind tonight. First of all, let me just say, recognize each and every group that has been in this panel. I've been honored to have you from QDEP, Jim Owl's Democratic Club, Vocal New York, the Legal Aid Society, you know, recognize. Also, whether you are queer or not, do not wait. You don't get asked permission to speak. You don't ask permission when it's your turn. And guess what, folks? All of us are immigrants in one way or another, because on this continent, in this place, we were not the first. And don't shy away from politics. Take action in politics and get involved, because it controls your lives. And just do something, whether it is taking the name off of a bridge that Alan talked about, whether it is getting people out of prison, whether it is funding organizations, organizing folks and taking action, as Jawanza said, is one of the hardest things in the world. But guess what? We won't stop. We won't stop. So again, thanks everybody for being a part of this discussion. This discussion was hot. It was like nuclear. So stay tuned to the Black Institute, where we will have more real, raw race discussions. Also, get in touch with us at info@theblackInstitute.org. We will be seeing you all again next month. And thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. And follow us. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, or just give us a holler. Thank you all, everybody. This has been great.
Thank you, Bertha.
Thank you so much, Bertha. We appreciate you.
Well, guess what?